instructed to move this forward.
That's fine.
Well, good morning. First, I want to express my gratitude for the church here. Without your support, my wife and I couldn't be in Graham, and so it's really great for us to have churches like you. My father is a preacher, and so it's been a long standing tradition of my family to be asking for support, and I've seen so many churches deny support for preachers, and so it's really good to see a group of Christians like you who are willing to support a work like that. It's a great blessing to me. Something that you should know about preachers is we write sermons as lectures. And then when we're asked to do a Bible class and I want to get some class participation, it makes things a little bit difficult to adapt a sermon for that purpose. So please, if you have any questions or comments, I'm going to try to give some moments to answer questions. But if you have a question or a comment, please just go ahead and get your hand raised. I was a teacher. I taught English for a time, so I'm trained to look for hands raised. So feel free to get your hands up there. Our core text this morning is going to be 1 Samuel 25. 1 Samuel 25. I'm going to have some other verses to go about. So if you have a way of marking that so that you can turn to other verses, that would be fine. But 1 Samuel 25 is going to be the core of our lesson this morning. I want us to consider this phrase that we find in the New Testament. And that phrase is, so far as it depends on you. There we go. So far as it depends on you. And what is the next part of that verse, that phrase? So far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. And what I want us to consider is this first part, as far as it depends on you. Paul words that very particularly. And so notice I have the word activity underlined. I want us to talk about peace as an activity. We often talk about peace as a feeling. I feel at peace. Or God puts me at peace. But I want us to consider peace as more of an activity and not a sentiment. Right? Those two ideas are very different, especially when it comes to us being Christians. On my way up here, I was listening to 100.5, which is a station that comes out of Graham. And they often play during the day, especially in the mornings, from Dr. Jeffress, who's the pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas. And he, like so many, pointed out about how we can't earn our salvation, which is absolutely true. But what people tend to forget is there are a lot of actions that are required of us. There are works that are required of us. And so we need to consider it from that particular vein. But I want us to first consider maybe the opposite of peace, or the activity of pursuing peace. I want us to first look at sins of discord, is the way it's put in Galatians 5. If you're willing to turn there, you don't have to. Galatians 5, starting in verse 19. Now the deeds of the flesh are evident, which are immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmities, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, disputes, dissensions, factions, envying, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these, of which I forewarn you, just as I have forewarned you, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. I want us to go back through this list very carefully. There are some sins here that maybe you wouldn't necessarily think are, or might pass you by. The first makes sense: immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, and sorcery. Those all make perfect sense to us. But then we start getting into enmities, being at enmity with one another, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, disputes, dissensions, factions, and envying. All of these things are what go against the activity of peace. They prevent us from being able to pursue peace to the degree that God would have us to do. And notice that the way he puts it, those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. That's very easy for us to engage in some of these activities because that's what it's natural for us to do. Isn't that really what most sin is working on our gut feelings? Right? I'm just going at it from the way that I want to instead of stopping and thinking about what God would rather me do. Now, in pursuing peace, we have to understand that this doesn't come easily. That this has some effort involved with it. It's not just getting up and going outside. There's a lot more to it than that. Turn to 1 Peter 3:10, if you're willing. 1 Peter 3:10. Peter here talks about some skills that we might need. Starting in verse 10. For the one who desires life, he's quoting from Psalm 34 here. For the one who desires life, to love and see good days, must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. He must turn away from evil and do good. He must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears attend to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those that do evil. There are a couple of things mentioned here. First, keeping his tongue from speaking evil and his lips from speaking deceit. We know how difficult that is from James, right? James is the one that tells us how difficult it is for us to tame our tongue. But he also keeps going on from there. Must turn away from evil and do good. We always must point that out. That being a righteous Christian is not just not doing good. It's not an absence of evil, but it's an absence of evil that is filled with good in the space that it leaves behind. And then he has this, we must seek peace and pursue it. Seek and pursue. These are terms that we use for predators, right? That are hunting in the wild. Seeking and pursuing. But it's not to a destructive end, it's to a constructive end. To seek and pursue peace. And then notice the ante of this. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears attend to their prayer. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Again, an echoing of what Paul said. Peter often talks about reading Paul's letters and how weighty they are. And so you can clearly see the echoing here. And then I want you to turn over to Romans 5. Romans 5. Here's where we often look at peace as a sentiment, right, instead of an activity. But I want us to consider what Paul is really saying here in Romans. Just an understanding of how Romans is structured. What Paul often does is he starts down one point and gets to a certain place and says, okay, I'm going to move on, but we're going to come back. Right? Which is where a lot of the misconceptions about Romans come from. We forget that he's going back and addressing things that he's previously stated. And so here he's been working on this idea in the first 3 chapters of being justified through faith. And he's come at this from the standpoint of how the rest of the world thinks and how the Jews had been thinking about salvation and how we receive our justification from God. So now he's coming back to the point here in Romans 5. We're going to start in verse 1. Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom also we have obtained our introduction by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we exult in hope of the glory of God. So I want us to consider this phrase, in which we stand. When we see this idea of standing, especially when it comes from Paul, we see this often in 1 Corinthians. Paul using this idea of standing, and there's always an action involved behind it. It's not just being still, but it's about taking a stand. And so there's this action involved here, that it's something to pursue. Going over to 1 Corinthians 10, he who thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. Right? The idea of taking a stand, and then when he goes on into verse 13, the idea of taking a stand is one to be fighting against the devil and against his temptation. There's effort here. We may not think about standing as effort, because we do it all the time, but it does take a lot of effort, considering all the pressures that might try to keep us away from standing and standing up for what is right. But I also want us to consider how this peace was achieved. There's a twofold reason why I use Romans 5. There's a reason why this peace was achieved, and it's through the activity of another. Christ was often at peace, pursuing peace. How often did he go and speak to his Father? Right? For hours at a time. But ultimately, even through the times of tribulation, he was able to persevere until he helped us achieve peace. And we're going to find when we actually try to break down some of these actions, you'll be able to see, oh, Jesus did that, he did that, he did that. Right? We find this all throughout, particularly the New Testament scriptures. But there are a few ideas behind peace and how to obtain peace. And that's where we're going to start here next. The first way of pursuing peace, you might think, well, duh, but there's a reason why it's up here. Averting strife. Averting strife. All right, we just read in Galatians about how strife was one of the things that when we're pursuing strife, we find ourselves at odds with God. And so the idea of averting strife is really step number one. We often think of peace as more of a damage control, if you will. Oh, now we're not at peace, and so I need to achieve peace. Except that's not really the way that peace ultimately works and is able to thrive at its best. Where it really thrives at its best is to not have strife in the first place. So I want us to consider some ways to avert strife. And the first is cultivating our relationships with one another. In 1 Peter 1, I want you to consider what Peter says here. Since you have in obedience to the truth purified your souls for a sincere love of the brethren, fervently love one another from the heart. For you have been born again, not of seed which is perishable, but imperishable, that is, through the living and enduring Word of God. So notice the connection that he makes here. You have, in obedience to the truth, purified your souls for love. And love of who in particular? Love for the brethren in particular. Of course, that love, as we're told throughout all the New Testament, extends beyond that, but that's where we must start. Go back and think about what we read in Galatians 5. Enmity, strife, disputes, jealousy, outbursts of anger. None of those things ever come out of love for someone else. They come out of frustration. They come from where you're at your wit's end. Right? We talk about the straw that breaks the camel's back, just that little thing that sends you over the edge. Right? That's what you're focused on when then you have an outburst toward your fellow man. It's not coming from a place of love as much as we might try to dupe ourselves into believing. It's the last place that it comes from. And these passages that I have listed up here also give similar concepts. That really, the idea of cultivating relationships is stemming from love for one another. What is the word that Paul most often uses about the relationships churches should have for one another. The members of churches should have for one another. Okay, so that's the kind of love that he often gives to describe God's love for us, in particular, the love that we ought to have for God, which influences this word that we're looking for. It's not a Greek word, looking for an English word here. So what is this word that he uses to describe our relationships, the relationship that we ought to have with one another? We are one family. There we go. I would have taken body. Family is the right answer. So we're supposed to be a family, right? And how often do we use this phrase, or have we used this phrase with our family, which is, well, I have to love you, right? We often use that phrase, and we use it in a joking manner, right? But there is an underlying reason for why we use that phrase, isn't there? We use it because it's true. We use it because ultimately it doesn't really matter what our families do. We love them anyway. Your siblings might get on your nerves. I grew up, I'm the youngest of 4. And all of my older siblings are all girls. 3 older sisters. Not easy by any stretch. I might have had it harder in a physical manner with brothers. So I didn't really get beat on, or anything. But growing up with sisters was somewhat difficult. And at many times we were at odds with one another. Many times. But they're still my sisters, right? They would get on my ever-loving nerves, but they were still my sisters. Or your parents, right? Yeah, my mom did this, and I'm really annoyed or upset. But at the end of the day, you wake up the next day, and you see your parents making you lunch for school, and that kind of made everything better, right? Yes, ma'am?
It's kind of like that, I can talk bad about my sibling, but you better not talk bad about my sibling.
That's right. And we have that, and that's not just Christians, right? Most people in the world, that's something that we can all share in, is that, yeah, you can talk bad about me all day long. I can talk bad about my siblings, but you dare talk about my siblings, and you will have me defense. Right? And this is the attitude that we have. But you know what? I don't think we understand that from that standpoint when we think about each other. Yes, we sit and talk about family all day long. And I will say this is one of the most frequent issue I think that I've seen with most Christians is the intellectual understanding of a concept, but not the practical understanding. Family is a very important word, not just to us, but in the Greek as well. And in the Hebrew, these words have such a transcendence of meaning. Which is why I love being at Graham so much. It really feels like a family there. To the degree that I'm not sure I've ever really felt before. And I've preached at other congregations. I've been at other congregations. I haven't quite felt it like that. I hope you all feel the same way about here. I don't know you well enough to know, but I'm sure I will eventually. And it's not just knowing everybody's business. That's not really the focus of being a family, is just knowing what's going on, but it's about having a deep love for one another. It feels like, oh, that's nice. And if that's the way it feels, there are some deep-seated issues that we need to deal with for Christ when we try to think about practically being a family. 1 Corinthians 13. 1 Corinthians 13. I think we know 1 Corinthians 13 fairly well, especially these first few verses. They get quoted often. 1 Corinthians 13, the point I want to start with is really in verse 5. Let's go up to verse 4. Let's get some context here. I'm a context guy. In order to understand the passage, you have to know the whole passage. Love is patient. Love is kind and is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant. Does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own. Is not provoked. Does not take into account a wrong suffered. Does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. Bears all things. Believes all things. Hopes all things. Endures all things. Love never fails. So is it any shock to people that when we talk about pursuing peace and averting strife, the core of it is love? Is anyone surprised? Because look at how Paul talks about what love ought to be and cause us to do. Then we start avoiding Galatians 5. We avoid enmity, outbursts of anger, jealousy, strife, etc. We avoid all those things because of our love for one another. Again, I hope we understand here from 1 Corinthians 13, love is just as much an action as peace is. It's not just a sentiment, I love you. I always say a picture is worth 1,000 words. I wonder what an action is worth. Maybe 1,000 more. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about the word averting and the word avoiding. You know, I can avoid strife by just going around it. But averting is a much more, I'm going to step in and take some action. You know, I'm going to try to get to peace instead of just avoiding the strife and taking the long way around it.
Right. Averting and diverting are very similar words. The meaning, the dictionary definitions are very, very similar. But I like this idea of averting, the way it should be pointed out, is this idea that I'm going to step up and redirect the strife. To make the strife go somewhere else. Instead of going around, because what happens when we go around something, its path doesn't change. And eventually it just explodes in our faces, right? Or really in our backs if we try to go around it, right? Then we're hit from behind. We get a sucker punch, and we don't know where it came from. Are you sure you don't know? Or are you just blind to what you did? Right? I just went around it. Instead of stepping in and trying to redirect the strife. Yes, sir?
Well, and usually strife comes about because of emotions. You know, especially Galatians chapter 5 with the works of the flesh. The outbursts of emotions. You know, Paul would explain to the Ephesians, be angry but sin not.
Right.
You know, we're going to have these feelings. We're going to feel frustrated. We're going to feel angry sometimes. People cut us off. Road rage happens, right? But it's the dealing with that and speaking to your and Snoopy's point of averting strife, thinking of it like this bubbling up of emotions. There is a way to handle things and a way to approach difficult circumstances and a way to approach difficult people that isn't the same thing as strife, you know. And so the idea of averting, and you can look at it not even so much as trying to move around it or trying to avoid it, but maybe more like a fire that you're attempting to put out, you know, as opposed to the idea that letting this emotional sequence of events, this emotional moment, try to calm it down. And of course that goes with showing love, remembering the relationship you may have with that person, especially among brethren. That, you know, sometimes we're human, you know, and sometimes we say things in the moment that we maybe shouldn't have said. But to be humble and to recognize, to apologize if we're the ones having said that, to be understanding if we're on the receiving end of that, to be able to talk through it peaceably, and be able to get past the emotional issues that sometimes arise. And that, I think, has everything to do of going back to the initial point that you made about as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. You know, that it's not always going to depend on us. But as much as we can control our emotional reaction to others. And that's kind of a key point to averting strife.
Right, and we're going to get to that point in the next slide here. But right here, just at the end of this point, I think that another point to remember, right? Because our actions are always controllable. Right? Our actions are always controllable, and that means that our actions stem from inside of us. My thoughts, my feelings, as we just pointed out, right? That they come from deep inside us. And Christ talked about this many times, but especially when it talks about the words that we use, right? The words that the tongue proceeds, out of the tongue comes from where?
Heart.
The heart. Right? And so do our actions. Our actions come from the heart as well. And sometimes, to help us avert not just other people's strife, but our own, we have to understand the blessings that we have received. 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 18. I'll go back up to 16. Rejoice always. Pray without ceasing. Those two things obviously go together. In everything give thanks, for this is God's will for you in Jesus Christ. But notice that this is on the tail end of some other important verses that we might be missing out. And if we start there, go up to verse 12. But we request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who diligently labor among you, and have charge over you in the Lord, and give you instruction, that you esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Live in peace with one another. We urge you, brethren, admonish the unruly, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with everyone. See that no one repays another for evil and evil, but always seek after that which is good for one another and for all people. Notice that getting into rejoicing and praying and giving thanks comes from pursuing peace. When we are able to understand where we come from, our blessings, it's easier for us to avert our own strife and the strife of others. But of course, it comes from the core of love.
And especially when you consider verse 13 with verse 14, it's not just we agree to disagree or let bygones be bygones. He says in verse 14, warn those who are unruly. Okay, it's not like, well, we're going to go out of our way to not point any fingers or cause any problems or make a fuss or anything like that. You stand for the truth. But then in the same voice, he says, be at peace among yourselves. So it's not a matter of avoiding difficult scenarios like warning those who are unruly. It's a matter of choice of how we deal with one another in love. Right. And especially making sure, like when you warn those who are unruly, that it's done from a source of love, that that's the motivation. And that's one thing that the religious world kind of gets the other way around.
Right. And notice the two things that we've already addressed being brought up here. One, it's not about avoiding, it's about averting. Right? Avoiding strife is not warning the unruly. I don't want to get involved. Right? I don't want to get on his or her bad side. That's the last thing I want to do. But then also the idea of standing. That phrase just used, standing for the truth. Again, it takes action, doesn't it? Look at everything that it says here in 14. Admonish the unruly, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient. That's 4 actions right there. Standing and pursuing peace are actions. And they're actions built up on the backs of more actions. Yes, ma'am?
I think we take standing for granted. You know, when we stand, gravity's constantly pushing down on us. Mm-hmm. And when we sit, we have a broader surface to spread that pressure out. Mm-hmm. You know, and so when we talk, like I subbed Friday in a 4th grade classroom, and they had this thing where they went around the room, and by the end of 16 rotations, almost every kid had grabbed a chair. These are 4th graders to sit down. Mm-hmm. You know, because sitting is easier than standing. Right. And so when we have to stand for the truth, that is very much an action. Mm-hmm. You know, every time we stand up, we fight gravity. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it is a very, very much a verb, action.
And the idea of standing for the truth is actually something that we're gonna get into in the lesson in our second service of the day at 1. We're going to get into the idea of defending the truth and the effort that requires. However, sometimes, right, as we keep mentioning, as much as depends on you, sometimes it doesn't. As much as we might sit here and try to avert strife, sometimes it finds us anyway. So now when it's here, what do? I haven't been able to avert anything, but we've still mentioned about being at strife with one another and what we ought to do about that. So where do I need to start when it comes to now bringing peace back? We've lost the peace. Now we have to bring it back. And it all starts with us. Again, when we sit here and try to say that the person, especially sometimes if we don't realize it's us, but the person who caused the strife needs to take action. Action's never easy. If you're waiting for the other person, action will never be taken. For multiple reasons. Maybe they're too embarrassed about losing the peace. Maybe they're so upset that they've just planted their feet. Right? Isn't that kind of what's going on in our political sphere right now? Everyone's just so upset with one another, they've just planted their feet. And now we have innocent people not getting paid. Because neither side is willing to budge. Because we're so at odds with one another. And is it any surprise that our government doesn't work? So the first choice we have to make is how we respond to conflict. Proverbs 17. Proverbs 17. And of course, we go to Proverbs to find some of this, right? The book of wisdom. Solomon, the wisest man on earth, giving us help when we need it. Proverbs 17, verse 14. The beginning of strife is like letting out water, so abandon the quarrel before it breaks out. You ever seen what happens when you relieve pressure from a high-pressure environment? I mean, it's as simple as turning on your faucet, right? You have pressure built up in your pipes, and you can immediately turn the faucet all the way on, and you don't have to wait for it, right? You don't have to wait for that. You've got water coming out. There's pressure built up in those pipes, and needs to be relieved. We see this in movies often. We'll see that someone will knock a hole in something, all of a sudden the liquid or the gas just spilling out at an incredible rate. Right? And that's what he's saying, is that's what the beginning of strife is. And we all know how it ends, right? I'm not saying the physics is right, but think back to Jaws, right? What happens when he shoots the oxygen tank in the shark's mouth? Just letting out a little bit of pressure caused a devastating reaction. So notice that he says the beginning of strife is like letting out water. That's just the beginning. But eventually it will get out of control and will explode in our faces. And what is his response? Abandon the quarrel. Again, this is not about avoiding anything. But I think Solomon's point here is, why are you quarreling? Because just about any reason that he could think of, it's better to abandon the quarrel and reduce the strife and the enmity between one another before rejoining the conversation. Yes, sir?
We ought to be able to see it coming. We're adults, we're mature, we ought to see things getting ready to boil over. And that's where he uses the word before. Before it gets to that stage where it's almost uncontrollable, do some action. And the action you can talk about all more.
And what happens, right? You said we see it, right? Again, intellectually we understand what's going on. I see what's coming, but what's in your mind? Oh, Oh, I gotta give him a piece of my mind, right? I gotta speak to the manager.
You're not the one to be talking.
Exactly. We forget that I'm the problem when I'm thinking like that. When I'm trying to sock it to him. That's the problem. You are now the problem. Which is why it depends on you. You are the problem. I'm loving these comments, but we're going to, in order to get to our core passage here, I'm going to have to keep going here. Again, how we make choices on confronting the difficult situations. I'm just going to read Galatians 6 very quickly. Again, remember, we're coming off of Galatians 5 after what he just said about averting strife and not being at enmity with God, and then he moves on to talk about the way to channel the Spirit through you. Galatians 6:1, brethren, if any one of you is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. There's two things right there. Each one looking to yourself so you too will not be tempted. 3. So there's 3 things we have to consider with our choices. 1, he says, you who are spiritual, restore such one. He doesn't say the one who committed the strife. Maybe that still is you. But he doesn't say the one who committed the strife. He said, you need to handle it. Doesn't matter which side of this you're on, you need to handle it. And you need to handle it gently. It doesn't mean coddling. It means gently. And then he said, looking to yourself, as we just talked about. Looking to yourself. Make sure you are being the person you ought to be. Notice it never mentions who started the strife here in Galatians 6. It doesn't matter. And resolving conflict. We have to make choices of how we resolve the conflict. Because guess what? A bat over the head is not resolving any conflict. I think sometimes we do that. We get heavy-handed, and now we've lost it. When you're arguing with someone, what do? When you start yelling back at them, what happens?
Never.
Dig in, right? Yeah, exactly. Dig in. No, now you're just making me angry. Yes, Dave.
This makes me think of the story where the men brought the prostitute to Jesus. And he just said, you who are without sin, cast the first stone. That was gentle.
Right.
You know, and then he says to her, go and sin no more. You know, very gentle. He diffused the situation, you know.
Notice here, he doesn't say, I know you didn't do what they're accusing you of. He never says that. He says, go and sin no more. But gently is still effective. Got the point across. Matthew 5. I love this verse from Christ. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you. Now, we'll talk about what that means. There are 2 ways that can be interpreted. Leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. So, the idea of your brother has something against you can be interpreted in either way. Either your brother has sinned against you, he has something against you, something you're holding him against you for, or you have done something to your brother, and your brother is holding that against you. Either way, if that is not resolved, what does it affect? Your worship to God. God says, worshiping me comes second to making your life right with your brother. Don't even bother trying to worship me. Go and take care of that. Then you can come to my throne. Now, I want us to go back to 1 Samuel 25. Hopefully you marked it. I know we moved around quite a bit. We're going to look at Abigail. I think she's the best topical example of this. She and her actions here in 1 Samuel 25 are extremely telling. David and his men, he's been running around from Saul. He's got men with him. He's been living some time with with the Philistines, and he will live some more with them. But he has found he's found a man that had some shepherds. It says that he was a Calebite. His name is Nabal. And David and his men have been protecting his shepherds. Now, he did it without asking, but it was extremely dangerous at that time to be a shepherd. So most managers who had shepherds working under them were very thankful whenever they had unwarranted help. There were a lot of predators out there that would strive to kill the shepherds. And then he goes to Nabal and says, look, I'm not asking for a full thing of payment here. I would just like some food for my men. And Nabal, and it says Nabal in his wickedness denies David. When Abigail finds out, she takes it upon herself to fix the situation. Now, who is this strife between? Nabal, her husband, and David. She's only in the mix by proxy, just because she's Nabal's wife. She takes it upon herself. And sadly, I wish we could have spent more time on this, but we're going to go through some of these points here. First, in verse 17, she shows awareness. She's come to David and she says, now therefore know and consider what you should do, for evil is plotted against our master and against all his household, and he is such a worthless man, no one can speak to him. That's what the Nabal's servant tells Abigail. This is what's going on, and we can't fix it. Nabal is such a worthless man, we can't fix it, and we need your help. So then, she takes quick action. Then Abigail hurried and took 200 loaves of bread, 2 jugs of wine, and 5 sheep already prepared, and 5 measures of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Where did she get the permission to do this? She doesn't. It's so important for her to achieve peace that she doesn't even stop to care. And now she's making preparation, right? She's gathering up all this, and she said to her young men, go on before me, behold, I am coming after you. Go and tell him I'm coming. It'll stop him for a minute. Because now David's on the warpath now. He's going to take Nabal's life. So then she bridges the distance. It came about as she was riding on her donkey and coming down by the hidden part of the mountain, that behold, David and his men were coming down toward her, so she met them. And then in verse 23, she shows her humility. When Abigail saw David, she hurried and dismounted from her donkey and fell on her face before David and bowed herself to the ground. Then she assumes blame. On me alone, my lord, be the blame. Please let your maidservant speak to you and listen to the words of your maidservant. She doesn't give any excuses. Verse 25, she knows. Let my lord pay attention to this worthless man Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. That's what his name means. Worthless. I'm not sure what's going on with his parents when that happened, but then she strives to make restitution. Let this gift which your maidservant has brought to my lord be given to the young men who accompany my lord. I know that wrong has been done to you, and I'm going to make restitution. And then she asks for forgiveness. Please forgive the transgression of your maidservant, for the Lord will certainly make for my lord an enduring house, because my lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil will not be found in you all the days of your life. And when you notice here, all these things were things that Jesus did in his sacrifice and in his life. He was aware of the problem, and in relative terms, takes quick action. He was only ministering, preaching for 3 years, right? He made preparation. He prepared himself to be a perfect sacrifice. He bridges the distance between us and God. He lowered himself to be here. He assumed the blame. He didn't take excuses. Well, I'm God, I don't have to do this. He made restitution, and he didn't ask for forgiveness, but he gave.